Dare to Defy Part 2, Parallel World, Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 12. Everyone seemed eager to go, but Nathan, Kelly, and Mitch seemed especially excited. How often did they leave the house? "Where are we going to go?" Nathan asked. "We're going to test Morgan and Billy's new looks," Jack said. I didn't like the sound of that, but I knew I couldn't stay in this house for the rest of my life. "What do you mean?" Billy asked. "Well," Danny said, "we'll have each of you go into some public place and see if anyone recognizes you. First, we'll have you each go in alone, then we'll have you appear together." "That sounds dangerous," Nathan said. I wholeheartedly agreed, but I didn't want to sound afraid, so I stayed quiet. "The rest of us will be just outside," Jack said. "That way we can take off quickly if needed." "What do you think, Morgan?" Billy asked. Not wanting to express my fear, but not wanting to encourage this exercise either, I shrugged. "What about you?" "I guess it's worth a try." If he felt okay about it, then I would do it too. I literally trusted him with my life over the last few days. In fact, he was the only person I trusted. "All right." "Good," Danny said with a smile. "This is the only way to see if your new looks will work." I agreed, although I wished there was another way. We all piled into a van. Jack drove, and Danny sat in the passenger seat. Billy and I sat in the middle bench next to the door. Somehow Bryn had managed to sit on the other side of Billy. The rest of the group crammed into the back seat. The windows were tinted, and I liked the feel of invisibility that gave me, even though I knew it was just a thin sheet of glass separating me from those who would capture me. As we backed out of the garage, I looked out the window. I'd been asleep when we'd arrived earlier that morning, so I had no idea where we were. The neighborhood looked ordinary, nothing to make it stand out at all, and the houses were copycats of each other. I studied the front of Jack's house and noticed a neat row of flowers planted on each side of a walkway that led to the front door. Who had planted them? Jack? Or maybe Tracy? How much time did Tracy spend here anyway? We drove for about 15 minutes before we reached a strip mall and pulled into a parking slot far from the walkway that lined the storefronts. Danny turned in the front seat and looked between me and Billy. "Who wants to go first?" Sudden fear swept over me, and I stared at Billy. He stared right back at me. "I'll go," I heard myself say, and immediately wanted to take it back. "Okay," Billy said, stopping me from saying I changed my mind. "Go into that clothing store," Danny said, pointing to a store whose windows showed the latest fashions. "What should I do once I get inside?" "Just browse the racks," she said. "You know, pretend you're looking for a new blouse or something." "Okay." I shifted my eyes to Bryn, who nodded with encouragement, probably because she was the one who had created my new look. Then I turned to the 4 people jammed into the back seat. Nathan appeared worried, reflecting exactly how I felt. Mitch stared out the window, apparently more interested in what was going on outside than what I was about to do. Tracy said, "You'll do great," though I wasn't so sure. And Kelly gave me a half-smile, which I didn't know how to interpret. "Go ahead," Danny said, which was easy for her since she wasn't the one who was being hunted by enforcers. Reluctantly, I undid my seatbelt and turned to the sliding door. Hoping Billy would offer to go instead, I hesitated, but after several beats it was obvious I would have to follow through. I pulled on the handle, and the door slid open. I stepped onto the pavement and turned toward Billy. "Here goes nothing," I said. He nodded, but didn't say anything. As I began sliding the door closed, I saw Bryn tap Billy's arm, and he turned away from me and toward her. The fact that he would turn away from me at this very moment, the moment I was about to put myself at greatest risk, upset me, and I slammed the door without meaning to. My gaze went to the passenger window, and my eyes met Danny's. She had a questioning look on her face. I mouthed the word, "Sorry." Then, with anxiety churning in my gut, I walked toward the clothing store. When I reached the door, I hesitated, but forced myself to pull the door open. A little bell rang, and my eyes widened as the clerk looked up from the book she was reading and regarded me. "Hello," she said. "Hi." Expecting her to jump up and scream that she knew who I was and that she was going to call the enforcers that very minute, I felt my heart slamming against my ribs. She set her book down. "Is there anything you're looking for in particular?" "No," I quickly answered. "Just browsing." She smiled and picked up her book. "Okay, let me know if you need any help." Then she went right back to her book. Sighing softly in relief, I went to the farthest rack. There were no other shoppers in the small store. I began browsing through the clothes. I hardly noticed what I was looking at as my attention kept going to the clerk, scared she would realize she'd seen my face before and knew I was the escapee from the F.A.T Center who had a price on her head. I was so focused on my concern that she would recognize me that when I pulled my attention away from her and looked to my right, I gasped at the girl looking back at me. For a split second, I thought she was staring at me. Then I realized it was a mirror. I was looking at my own reflection. I relaxed as I reassured myself that I looked nothing like the Morgan who had escaped from Camp Willowmoss. My confidence growing, I began to enjoy the feeling of normalcy that shopping brought and selected several shirts and a pair of jeans. I asked the clerk if I could try them on. She set her book down and unlocked a dressing room. "Let me know if you need any different sizes or anything," she said, though I could tell she hoped I wouldn't interrupt her reading again. I tried on all the clothes and actually liked 2 of the shirts and the jeans. I wondered if Jack or Danny would buy them for me. I didn't have any clothes of my own after all. I admired myself in the dressing room mirror as I tried them on again. I put on my own clothes and opened the door to the dressing room. Just as I did, a woman and 2 teenage girls walked into the store. It was at that moment that I knew that only having one person see me in my new look wasn't much of a test, and a new feeling of anxiety crashed over me as I prepared myself for phase 2 of this test. The sales clerk greeted the new customers, then called out to me, "Did any of those work for you?" I felt like the proverbial deer in the headlights as I noticed the woman and her daughters scrutinizing me. My gaze went from the sales clerk to the 3 new customers and back again. Yeah," I managed to say. "Can you hold these for me?" I held up the items I wanted. "Sure," the clerk said. "What's your name?" Michelle," I quickly corrected. "Michelle?" "Yeah." "We can only hold them for 24 hours. "Okay." I shifted my eyes back to the woman and the 2 teenagers. They were ignoring me now, which thrilled me. 4 people had seen me and exactly 0 had recognized me. Giddy with relief, I left the store and went back to the van. As I slid the door open, I immediately noticed that Billy was absorbed in a conversation with Bryn. "How'd it go?" Danny asked. I glanced at her, then back at Billy, who finally turned and looked at me. "Hey, Morgan," he said. "I see you made it back." "It was fine," I said to Danny. "I hope you don't mind, but I asked them to hold a couple of things for me." "Oh," she said. "Okay, yeah, I guess you need a few things." "Thank you." "I'll have someone pick them up later." She paused. "What name did you give them?" "Michelle." My eyes flicked to Billy. He was the one who'd originally given me that name. Then I looked back at Danny. "Good," she said. "Okay, Billy, your turn. Go into that sports store over there." She pointed to a store several doors down from the store I'd been in. "Okay." He smiled at me, and I could tell he was a little nervous. I knew how he felt, but now that I'd finished my turn, I had confidence that he would do fine. He left, and I watched through the tinted glass as he strode across the parking lot and into the sporting goods store. I stared out the window as the minutes ticked by. "Uh-oh," Bryn said a few minutes later, a sense of urgency in her voice. Chapter 13. My gaze snapped to the store Billy had been in, and I saw him running toward us, motioning with one arm to go, go, go. I slid open the van's side door, and Billy leapt through. I slammed the door shut, Jack pressed the gas, and we lurched forward. I assessed Billy, who was lying on the floor, breathing hard from his sprint. Was he all right? "What happened?" Danny asked, no hint of concern in her voice. "Someone recognized me." Her eyebrows rose a millimeter. "Are you certain?" He nodded. "Tell me exactly what happened." Billy got up from the floor and sat in the space between me and Bryn. I glanced at Bryn and noticed her closely watching Billy's every move. Without thinking, I put my hand on Billy's back as a gesture of support. He smiled at me. Bryn glared at me. I ignored her and focused on Billy. When I got inside the store, he said, I just began looking around. You know, checking out the equipment, looking at the shoes. I even asked to try on a pair. He glanced at me and smiled. I could use some new shoes. I peered at his feet and saw that his shoes were pretty beat up. For some reason, I hadn't noticed that before. Go on, Danny said. So, the clerk was getting my size, and I was just about to take off my shoes when this kid, couldn't have been more than 9 years old, he said, Hey, aren't you that guy on TV? I told him to beat it, but he wouldn't leave, so I got up. But then the clerk came back with the shoes. The kid pointed at me and told the clerk I looked like the guy the enforcers were looking for. I tried to laugh it off, and the clerk didn't seem to believe him, but the kid wouldn't shut up and kept getting louder and louder, I guess because no one would listen to him. Billy became more agitated as he spoke. More people started staring at me, and then some old guy said, Yeah, you're right, kid. That's when I told the clerk I'd come back another time, and then I heard a woman yell for someone to call the enforcers. I walked toward the door, and some man stood in my way. Billy paused and turned to me. Can you believe he wasn't going to let me leave? Billy looked back at Danny. So I punched him. I heard Bryn gasp, and I wondered what she would think if she knew I'd stabbed Hanson. Maybe she would think twice before glaring at me. People yelled at me to stop, Billy said. Of course I ignored them and booked it out here. I didn't see anyone following you before he left, Jack said, so I think we're in the clear. I think Billy's disguise might need a little work, Tracy added from the back seat. I shifted my eyes to Bryn to see how she was taking this news, but she seemed happy. I guess because that meant she'd get some time alone with Billy. I'm already getting ideas, she said. Or maybe, Billy added, we can leave my hair alone and I'll just stay out of sight for a while, until the search cools off. Danny said. Let Bryn give your look one more try, then we'll see what we want to do next. When we got back to the house, we gathered in the living room, or what they call the meeting room, to further discuss our next moves. Honestly, all I wanted was to stay out of sight for the next 6 weeks, then head to Fox Run and the tunnel that would take me home. As much as I hated the way things were done in this world, I wasn't willing to risk my chance to get back home to help these people. This was their world, not mine. They would have to figure out how to fix it, without me. But until the 6-week mark arrived, I would need to play along. If I didn't, I was certain they would be more than happy to kick me out of their little safe house. It seemed pretty clear that if I couldn't contribute, I wasn't worth a whole lot to them. That was an interesting exercise, Danny said. Somewhat successful. She turned to me. Morgan, how many people saw you in that store? 4, I said. The worker and a woman and her 2 teenage daughters. Okay. She looked at Billy. And how many saw you? I guess about 10, but the kid who recognized me was the second person to see me close up. So either he got lucky, Danny said, or the disguise just didn't work. Billy shrugged, not seeming too concerned. Then again, he always seemed cool under pressure. Tracy stood. Kelly, Bryn, and Nathan, you're on dinner duty tonight. I watched as the 4 of them left the room. That's something else we need to talk to you about, Danny said. Your assigned duties. Now this place was starting to remind me of Camp Willowmoss. Everyone needs to pitch in to keep things running around here, Jack said. What kinds of things can you do? I can fix stuff, Billy said. I didn't know he was good at that, but somehow I wasn't surprised. That kind of skill is always welcome, Jack said. I was going to mention my cleaning skills, but decided I would rather work in the kitchen. I can help in the kitchen. Great, Danny said, smiling. We all take turns cooking the meals and cleaning up. We post a schedule in the kitchen. I'll add you to the rotation. At least I wouldn't be cleaning the bathroom. Oh, Danny said, we also take turns cleaning the bathrooms. I held back a groan. At least it was just a normal bathroom, not 16 toilets, showers, and sinks. You're also responsible for keeping your own space clean in the bedroom, Danny added. All right, I said. One last thing, she said with a smile. You need to put in time each day on your studies. Wow, this really was just like Camp Willowmoss, but I knew it really wasn't. After dinner, grilled pork chops, steamed vegetables, and brown rice. Danny had Bryn work on Billy's look. After a while, the two of them came out of the bathroom. This time Bryn had put longer extensions in his hair, then pulled his hair into a ponytail with long strips hanging in his face. I didn't like the look as much as before, but it was a little harder to recognize him. Soon after, Danny, Tracy, and Bryn left to go to their homes. That left Jack, Nathan, Mitch, Kelly, and of course Billy and me. Jack went into his room where he had an office set up, and the rest of us went into the family room to watch TV. "They seem like nice people," Billy said to me in a quiet voice as we sat on the floor, our backs against the couch. "I guess. I like them well enough, but I still would have preferred to be with my family." "What's up with Bryn?" Billy said this with a grin that said he knew exactly what was up with her. "What do you mean?" No way would I help them with their budding romance. He smirked. "Never mind." I turned away from him and looked at the TV, not really paying attention to what was on. Mitch had the remote, and evidently he didn't like what was on because he kept changing the channel. I didn't really care what we watched. I was just glad we had a safe place to spend the night. "Wait," Billy said. "Go back one." I wondered what he'd seen and waited for Mitch to go to the previous channel. When I saw what had caught Billy's eye, all my attention became riveted to the television. Chapter 14. It was my house in Timber Hills. The camera panned from one side of our property to the other, and I saw a dozen enforcers surrounding my house. "What's going on?" I murmured. Billy put his hand on my shoulder, but I hardly noticed. "There have been a number of tips that have come in," the reporter said, "and each one is taken seriously. There have been reports that the fugitives, Morgan Campbell and Billy Foster, have been seen in this neighborhood, perhaps at this very house. As some of our viewers may know by now, this is the Campbell residence. Mr. Campbell has been in a federally assisted thinning center for several weeks now." The reporter frowned as he shared this bit of news. "And now his daughter, Morgan Campbell, is a wanted fugitive. She, along with Billy Foster, assaulted an enforcer during their brazen escape from Camp Willowmoss just days ago." "Hear that, Morgan?" Billy said with a grin. "We're brazen." "Shut up." I didn't like what they were saying about my family. Even more, I didn't like the way the enforcers were approaching the front door. They were lined up in two groups, one group on each side of the door. Why were they there? Did they really think Billy and I were inside? I imagined what it would be like if we really were inside and the enforcers were waiting to storm the house. Would we be able to run out the back? More enforcers had to be waiting there. I hoped they hadn't hurt Goldie, who would be upset that strangers were threatening her family. What would they do to us if they caught us? Would they just take us back to Camp Willowmoss, or maybe to a F.A.T center with tighter security? If that happened, how would I get out in time to get back to the tunnel? I would be stuck in this world forever. I watched as one enforcer pounded on the front door. As we all watched to see what would happen next, the room was dead silent. Was anyone even home? It was early evening, so chances were that Mom, Amy, and the boys were all there. No one answered the door, and I pictured them huddled together in a closet, too scared to move or make a sound. And it was all because of me. If I hadn't shown up in their world and broken a rule and been a few pounds over my allowed weight, I wouldn't have been taken to Camp Willowmoss in the first place. And then, if Billy and I hadn't escaped, and if I hadn't stabbed Hanson, the enforcers wouldn't be after us. If anything happened to my family, it would totally and completely be my fault. My imagination ran wild as I visualized all kinds of outcomes to what was unfolding in front of me live on television. The enforcers must have gotten tired of waiting, because the one holding a battering ram stepped forward and slammed it into the front door. It took 2 swings, but the door broke off its hinges and fell inward. The enforcers surged through the breach and disappeared from view. My heart kicked in my chest and tears filled my eyes as I imagined what was happening outside of the lens of the camera. After what seemed like hours, but could only have been 5 minutes, an enforcer came out the front door, holding tightly to my 13-year-old sister's arm, and led her down the stairs. Her hands were bound behind her back. The camera zoomed in, and I could clearly make out tears streaming down her face. "What are they doing with Amy?" I said to no one in particular, my voice on the edge of hysteria. "Is that your sister?" Nathan asked. "Yes." I never took my eyes from the TV. Just then another enforcer walked up to the first one and spoke to him, then gripped Amy's arm. The first enforcer let go and turned away. I was so busy watching my sister's face that it took a moment before I realized who now had custody of Amy. When his grinning face filled the screen, my breath caught in my throat and my stomach clenched. It was Hanson, the same enforcer whose groin I'd kneed the night I'd been hauled to the F.A.T center. The same enforcer who I'd stabbed only a few days before. The same enforcer who had said to me, "I will kill you." That same enforcer now had my sister. My younger, innocent sister. She hadn't done anything to him. She wasn't even overweight. What did they want with her? As if he'd heard my question, the reporter spoke. "I'm being told that Mrs. Campbell has agreed to let her daughter, the one you now see in custody, finish Morgan Campbell's time at Camp Willowmoss." "What?" I shouted as I leapt from the floor. "No way!" Mom would never agree to such a thing. There had to be some other reason she had let them take Amy. Or maybe she hadn't let them take her at all. Maybe they'd taken her by force. Was Mom even okay? "We're not being told the details of the agreement," the reporter went on. "But apparently, for the purposes of completing Morgan Campbell's time, Amy Campbell will be treated as if she is Morgan Campbell. However, there will be a separate sentence to be carried out by Amy Campbell on behalf of her sister Morgan for the crime of assaulting an enforcement officer, which will be announced at a later time." "They can't do that!" My voice was filled with outrage. I looked at the others in the room. "That's so not fair! She hasn't done anything wrong! How can they do this?" "As for Billy Foster," the reporter said, and we all turned back to the television, "his family has not been found, and a deal has not yet been worked out." "What do they mean, your family hasn't been found?" I demanded, angry and upset. "Where are they? Why aren't your younger brothers, if you even have any, being dragged away?" "Calm down, Morgan," Billy said, as unruffled as ever. I narrowed my eyes and spoke softly. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down." With my next two sentences, the volume of my voice rose as I spoke. "How dare you tell me to calm down? My sister's being taken away by Hanson." I was beyond all reason by this point. "You remember him, don't you, Billy? He's the one you tasered and the one I stabbed." I heard the others gasp and murmur in shock, but I ignored them. "He's the one who wants to kill me." I glared at Billy. "Still think I should be calm, do you?" He looked away from me and shook his head. Then he met my furious gaze. "Don't you see, Morgan? It's all for show. Next thing you know, they're going to say that if you turn yourself in, they'll release your sister." He smiled in what I guess was supposed to be a show of reassurance, but it didn't quite make the cut. "They won't hurt her." "And how do you know all of that?" That seemed to stump him, and I realized that he knew nothing of the sort. I'd really hoped he would have a good answer. Maybe he'd seen this kind of thing before, or he knew someone this had happened to, but no, he was just trying to placate me. "They're just trying to get you to turn yourself in," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "You know I can't do that." He frowned, like he'd hoped I'd forgotten about the whole parallel universe thing, like it had just been a wacky phase I'd been going through. "Right. I wasn't suggesting you do it, just that they want you to." I sighed. "They're taking her away," Mitch said, pointing to the TV. I watched as Hanson shoved Amy into the back seat of a car and slammed the door. The camera zoomed into the window of the rear seat where Amy was sobbing. Then Hanson climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away. Once the car was out of view, the camera panned back to the front door. There stood Mom, looking shell-shocked. My little brothers huddled next to her, obviously shaken. "I'll kill him," I muttered. "They're using her as bait," Jack said from the doorway. Chapter 15. As one, we turned toward Jack. He walked into the room, turned off the TV, and sat in a chair. "Have a seat, Morgan." He gestured to the spot next to Billy. I sank onto the floor and leaned against the couch. "What do you mean they're using her as bait?" Nathan asked. "Like to get these guys," he waved his hand in our direction, "to turn themselves in?" "That's exactly what they want." Jack leaned back in his chair and put his feet on the coffee table. "Then they can show that they really are in charge." I stared straight ahead, only half listening to their conversation, my mind focused on what Amy must be experiencing. Soon she would arrive at Camp Willowmoss and get chipped like an animal. They would put her in a room. I desperately hoped it would be with someone like Alex and not someone like Beth. Then have her meet with her caseworker, who would give her a schedule. She would probably be assigned cleaning duties, or maybe they would have her take over my job in the kitchen, and she would have to go to class each day. And tomorrow, oh no, tomorrow, would be her first Saturday challenge. Would she have teammates there to help her, or would they bully her and not care what happened to her? I didn't even know what her greatest fear was. I hoped whatever it was, it would not be realized. And then she would spend hours in the gym with Mr. Muscles. At the thought of him, I remembered my agreement that once Alex left, I would take over and be his girlfriend. When I'd made that bargain so that he would get back together with Alex so she wouldn't hate me, I'd never imagined things would turn out like this. If I'd had any idea such a thing could happen, I never would have made that deal. And then there was Hanson, the man who'd punched me in the stomach when I'd run away during the Saturday challenge. The man who'd helped the opposing team during the game of tug-of-war, forcing me to slip into the pit of writhing, hairy spiders. The man who had said in the clearest terms possible that he wanted to kill me. He would have access to my sister. It's true that Amy and I had never been close. In fact, she'd pretty much gotten on my nerves since the day she started walking, but she was still my sister, and she was in the situation purely because of me. "This is a new tactic on the part of the enforcers," Jack said. I pulled myself out of my thoughts and turned to him. "Why do you think they're doing this now, then?" "It's rare to hear of people escaping the F.A.T centers. Most people just want to do their time, get their weight to what it's supposed to be, and move on." He paused and smiled. "Most people don't want to have the enforcers chasing them for the rest of their lives." I didn't want that either, but here I was. "What about you?" I said, looking at Kelly. "Aren't you basically in hiding so you don't get taken to a F.A.T center?" She looked uncomfortable to be the center of attention. "Well, yeah." She glanced at the others, then focused back on me. "But I'm trying to get my weight right so that they won't take me away." Nathan snorted, and everyone looked at him. "What?" Kelly asked. "You know you'll get an automatic 3 months in a F.A.T center for running when you were supposed to turn yourself in," he said. "So will you," she said, anger clear on her face. "I was never officially told to come in," he answered. "No," she said, "but you've been off the grid for how long now? Like a year? What's the punishment for that?" I know. So we're both screwed any way you slice it." "That's enough," Jack said, putting his hands up as the argument ceased. "This isn't about you right now. Unfortunately, this is much more serious than the things you've both done." I wished he was wrong, but I knew he was exactly right. "What do you suggest?" Billy asked. "The way I see it," he said, "we can wait it out and see what happens. Or you can turn yourselves in and let the chips fall where they may." "What would be the benefit to me if I turned myself in?" Billy asked. "I can't really say that there would be any benefit to you," Jack said. "You wouldn't have to be in hiding for the rest of your life," Mitch pointed out. "There is that," Jack said with a smile, "but that assumes you come out of there unscathed." "Wait," I said, my hands in the air. "What do you mean unscathed? Why wouldn't he come out unscathed?" "He and you," Jack corrected. "I don't think the enforcers take too kindly to being made out as fools. You did escape, after all. That makes them look pretty bad." I hadn't thought about that. My only thought had been to get out and get back to my world. "Plus," Jack added, "the original reason you were in there would most likely play a part." Jack looked at Billy. "Why were you sent to the F.A.T center anyway?" "That's none of your business," Billy said as he stared at Jack, daring him to disagree. Okay," Jack raised his hands in surrender. Anyway, every answer has risk tied to it. There's no way around it. What if, I said, a new idea occurring to me. No, never mind. I shook my head, the idea sending tremors of fear cascading through me. What is it? Nathan asked. Yeah, Billy said. What were you going to say? I looked at him, remembering his comment in the counseling group about doing something risky for someone you love. Then I thought about Amy and the terror she must be experiencing at that very moment. We'd never been close, but we were sisters. We came from the same blood. Then I looked at Jack. What if I go back into Camp Willowmoss, but not as Morgan Campbell? What? Billy said, clearly shocked. Why? My sister is in there, I said. My voice began to shake with emotion as I vocalized my fears. She's only 13. She's a good kid. I paused. They're going to make her eat those power bars. Tears sprang to my eyes as I pictured my sister becoming addicted to the power bars. She was small. What would the compliance drug do to her? Would it turn her into a zombie? She's going to have to participate in the Saturday challenge, I said. Starting tomorrow. Billy seemed incredulous that I was even considering going back. Do you know what they would do to you if they realized your real identity? As the truth of his question sunk in, I was quiet. A myriad of horrors flashed through my mind, making me seriously rethink my suggestion. Morgan's right, Jack said. The best way to help your sister is to expose what's happening in those F.A.T centers. That wasn't what I had in mind. What I wanted to do was to orchestrate a rescue. Get in, get Amy, and get out. The details were completely fuzzy, but that was a basic mission I wanted to perform. Maybe. When I thought of voluntarily walking through those doors and pictured those drab hallways and imagined sitting in the waiting room to talk to Mr. Madsen, an enforcer mere feet from me, I went into a cold sweat. I couldn't go through with it. I would have to be certifiably insane to go back. Why would I risk my chance to get back home for a situation that only existed in this world? When I got back home, my sister would be fine, right at home where I'd left her, threatening to tell Mom that I was sneaking out. Right? But what if my coming into this world and screwing things up like I had somehow affected the other world? What if something bad happened to the Amy in my world because of what had happened here? And what would happen to the other Morgan when I left here? Would she suddenly appear in this world and find herself a wanted fugitive? She wouldn't have a chance. But I wouldn't be here, so why should I care? I rubbed my temples as a headache blossomed behind my eyes. It was all too confusing and uncertain. I didn't know how these parallel worlds worked. It was my first one, after all. I pressed a hand against my mouth to smother a giggle. I was really beginning to lose it. Are you okay? Billy whispered. I shook my head. No, not really. He rubbed my back but didn't speak, and I wondered what he was thinking. We don't need to make any decisions tonight, Jack said. I want to discuss these new developments with Danny first. He stood. Let's all meet in the meeting room right after breakfast, shall we? Everyone agreed, and Jack left the room. We sat there for a minute, the 5 of us, until Billy stood and reached down and grabbed my hand. I need to talk to you. I let him pull me to my feet, and I followed him into the meeting room. Chapter 16. No one was there, and he sat me in a chair and then sat across from me, close enough so we could talk softly without being overheard, but far enough away to establish our relationship as just friends. I don't know why I thought of it in those terms. Maybe I wished he would sit close to me, but that should be the last thing on my mind, what with my life potentially about to implode and all. What in the world are you thinking? He asked, anger flashing in his eyes, at least as much of his eyes as I could see through his long bangs. Are you demented, Morgan? I found it hard to meet his gaze because he was the only one who really knew what I would be getting myself into, and he disapproved. His objection scared me. If he didn't support this idea, then it had to be a bad one. I respected his opinion. He'd gotten us out of Camp Willowmoss when things had started to go wrong, and he kept us alive until we were able to meet Jack and Danny's group. I stared past his shoulder, picturing Amy's face as she sat in the back seat of Hanson's car, the tears streaming down her face, then met his gaze. What do you think I should do then, huh? Just leave her there to be abused by Hanson and the rest? In the back of my mind, okay, maybe it was more like the middle, I wanted to do just that. Just walk away and forget all about Amy and all the awful things she would experience. But I just couldn't do that. She was my family, my only sister. How could I live with myself if I knew I had stood by and done nothing to help her, especially since she was quite literally taking my place at Camp Willowmoss?
What about getting back to your tunnel on the right date?
His voice was soft, like he didn't necessarily believe anything about my story, but hoped I believed it enough to change my mind about going back to Camp Willowmoss. Frowning at his unbelief, as well as his voicing of one of my biggest worries, I sighed. That does make me really nervous about this idea. He smiled like he thought he'd gotten through to me.
You see? It's not a good idea. If you miss that date, you'll be stuck here forever, right? You don't want that.
No, I said. I most definitely don't want that. But Billy, wouldn't you do this if someone you cared about was hauled away because of you? He was quiet for a long moment.
There's no one I care about that much.
Shocked by his statement, I stared at him. No one? What about your family? I paused. You've never told me anything about them.
His jaw clenched. I don't have a family.
What do you mean? He stared past me, then slowly met my gaze.
My family didn't want to have to take care of me anymore. They said I was too much trouble and too expensive. So, when I was 15, they kicked me out and told me it was time for me to take care of myself.
He watched me, I guess wanting to see my reaction, but I stayed perfectly still, my eyes meeting his. I didn't want to do anything to discourage him from telling me his story. His voice softened. I had nowhere to go. He gestured to the space around us.
I didn't know anyone like Jack to help me out. It was all on me.
Sadness crept into his eyes.
For the first few days, the hunger was pretty bad, but eventually I got used to it. Then one night, a group of kids found me huddled in an alley trying to stay warm.
He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound.
They must have been bored because they seemed to really enjoy beating me.
Shocked by what he'd been through, I pressed my hand to my mouth to hold back a gasp. He laughed again.
Oh, it gets better.
Suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to hear his story. I spoke softly. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to.
No, it actually feels kind of good to get this out.
Have you told anyone before?
He shook his head. Not the whole story.
My heart warmed at knowing I was the first person he'd told, and I felt that much closer to him. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. What happened next?
An old woman found me when I was unconscious. Somehow she got me into her tiny apartment. I think she had a neighbor drag me in or something, and she took care of me.
Relieved that someone had shown him kindness, I smiled softly.
But she was really poor and hardly had enough for herself, let alone a growing teenager. So as soon as I was better, she told me I could crash at her place, but she couldn't share her food with me.
He paused and chewed his lip.
That's when I started stealing food from the local schools.
He laughed, and this time it sounded a little lighter.
It was so easy, too. I guess kids don't often want to break into the schools. I was able to get in through skylights in the roof or through a window left open. The food wasn't great, as you know, but I was happy to get my hands on anything I could. I would go every few days and vary the schools, but I guess they started noticing that food was missing, and that's when they installed hidden cameras in the kitchens. Of course, I had no idea that they were onto me. I guess the principals of the schools I'd hit had gotten together and talked about it and decided to catch whoever was taking their food. One night they got a good picture of me right in the act, and they put it on the news and even offered a reward. Again, I was clueless. The lady I was staying with didn't have a TV or anything, so I had no idea. But apparently my parents saw it and immediately recognized me. They scoured the neighborhood looking for me, and within a couple of days they found me as I was walking down the street. They told me they'd been looking for me for weeks. I'd been gone about 6 months by then, and said they'd realized their mistake in making me leave, and would I come back home. I was overjoyed that my family wanted me back, and I was all too eager to go with them. Billy's chin quivered,
and my stomach clenched as I anticipated the rest of his story.
As we drove, I became a little confused because I didn't recognize the neighborhood. Did we move? I asked them, but they patted me on the knee and reassured me that everything was fine. Next thing I knew, we pulled up to the nearest F.A.T center and they started honking their horn.
He looked at his lap and chewed on his lip. Then after a moment he spoke softly.
You can imagine how I felt as 4 enforcers ran out to the car and my parents quite literally handed me over to them.
He looked at me, a small smile on his face.
I fought as hard as I could and I punched one guy pretty hard. I think I broke his jaw.
Knowing exactly how that must have felt,
I felt a similar victory when I'd nailed Hanson between the legs and run away. I smiled. But they tasered me and I collapsed to the ground. The guy I punched even kicked me in the ribs, twice.
Billy smiled, but it was obvious he was trying to hide his real feelings.
But the best part, he took a quick, deep breath. The best part was when, as I lay paralyzed on the ground with my ribs cracked, my dad demanded the reward money then and there.
My heart broke for him. I couldn't begin to imagine being betrayed by my family like that. It wasn't even in the realm of possibility.
He wiped at his eyes and grinned. They told him he would have to wait 90 days, because they had to process the request, blah, blah, blah. Well, my dad was not happy about that, which made me happy.
Billy, that is so awful. I'm so sorry your family did that to you.
He leaned back in his chair. Yeah, it sucked.
Did your parents take you to Camp Willowmoss?
No, it was some other F.A.T center. I got transferred to Camp Willowmoss a few days later.
I remembered that after our escape, he'd mentioned he'd been unconscious in the back of an enforcer's car when he'd arrived at Camp Willowmoss.
How did that go? I asked. He grinned. It wasn't pretty. When they brought me out to the car, I tried to get away, and they took me down pretty hard.
I could so relate to that. Without thinking about it, I rubbed my cheek where the bruise had faded. He must have noticed.
You don't want to experience that again, do you?
After hearing his story, I understood why he didn't think it was worth it to take a risk for my sister, but that didn't change the fact that in my experience, my family was worth it. In fact, his story underscored how important it actually was to stand by my sister. If you couldn't count on your family, who could you count on? As I thought about all his family had put him through, I wished he could have had a family like mine, a family who would love him unconditionally and who would never betray him. Then it occurred to me that if he came with me back to my world, he could be with my family. Then he would know what a real family was all about. But first, I had to get my sister out of Camp Willowmoss. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I just knew I had to do it. I only hoped Billy would help me.
You're still going through with it, aren't you? He asked as he slouched in his chair.
I nodded. Yes, I can't leave my sister in there. I don't even know how long they would keep her there. I was supposed to be there for 6 months, and that was before the escape. How much time do you think they would add for that? He shook his head and stared at the ceiling, then looked at me.
You're making a huge mistake, one you're going to regret.
My heart sank at his words, because I feared he was right. Chapter 17. Billy pushed himself out of the chair.
I'm beat. I'm going to bed.
Then he walked out of the room. I stared in the direction he'd gone and felt very alone. He obviously had no intention of supporting me. If I was going to do this, I would be on my own. Or would I? Jack seemed to support the idea. True, he had his own agenda, but it was better than nothing. A feeling of optimism swept over me as I realized I might have help. "Hey, Morgan," Kelly called from the doorway. "Do you want to play a game with us?" I shook my head. "I'm actually really tired. I think I'll go to bed." "Okay, good night." "Night." After she left, I made my way to the room I would be sharing with her. Someone had sat out a pair of pajamas on the bed I'd be using, and I flashed back to my first night at Camp Willowmoss when Kiera had given me loaner clothes. I touched the pink and cream striped pajamas and longed for my bedroom at home. I would give anything, to be there now, especially if Amy was there too. I sank onto the bed and thought about what Amy must be doing right that minute. Was she with a nice roommate or with a bully? Would anyone take her under their wing, or would she be completely on her own? How long would it take for her to become addicted to the power bars? As I pictured walking into Camp Willowmoss, facing a room full of enforcers, and saving my sister, adrenaline pumped through me and all exhaustion fled. Though I wanted to go right that minute, if I wanted to succeed, I had to have a plan. Trying to calm myself, I took several slow, deep breaths, then went into the bathroom to get ready for bed. A new toothbrush sat on the bathroom counter, still in its packaging. As I picked it up, my gaze went to the mirror over the sink, and I recoiled at my appearance. I'd nearly forgotten the way I looked now. At first I frowned, not feeling like myself when I looked in the mirror, but then I smiled, because my new look would be perfect for hiding my true identity once I was back at Camp Willowmoss. I finished getting ready for bed, then climbed under the covers. An overwhelming feeling of safety settled over me, a feeling I hadn't had in nearly 2 weeks, not since before I'd been dragged away to the F.A.T center. I relished the feeling and was soon sound asleep. The next morning after I showered, making sure not to wash my hair, I tried to fix my hair the way Bryn had done it, and I thought it looked pretty good. It was so short that it was hard to mess up. I didn't attempt to put the makeup on, and even without the dark eyeliner, I didn't look anything like myself. After breakfast, Danny arrived, along with Tracy. Bryn came a while later. It was Saturday, and of course no school. As I ate, Danny and Jack walked off by themselves, speaking in low tones. I watched them go and wondered what they were saying. I was certain they were talking about me and my idea to go back to Camp Willowmoss. Billy came in a little while later, and my gaze went to Bryn to see her reaction. Her face lit up, and she rushed around getting him breakfast. He enjoyed being waited on, and it irritated me, until I remembered the story he told me the night before about all he'd been through. Even though I didn't like the interplay between him and Bryn, he deserved some happiness. "How'd you sleep?" I asked him as he sat in an empty seat next to me. "I haven't slept that good in a long time." I smiled. "Me either." "Much better than I ever slept at Camp Willowmoss," he said as he raised his eyebrows, like he was suggesting I should keep that in mind as I considered going back. "Uh-huh," I muttered as I speared a slice of cantaloupe. We ate in silence, then helped clean up. Once we were done, Danny appeared in the doorway and invited everyone to meet in the front room. I glanced at Billy, and he frowned. Everyone headed out of the family room. "You guys coming?" Bryn asked, stopping next to Billy and looking right at him. "Yeah, sure." His lack of enthusiasm was clear. I followed him and Bryn as they walked toward the meeting room. People were talking in small groups, and Bryn sat on a 2-person couch. She patted the cushion next to her. "You can sit here, Billy." He glanced at me, then sat beside her, leaving me alone. I sat on a recliner across the room from them. No one spoke to me, and I waited for the meeting to begin. "Good morning, everyone," Jack said, a bright smile on his face. "Morning," everyone echoed. "Before we begin, does anyone have anything they need to discuss?" No one spoke. "Okay," he said. "Then I'd like to get right to it." He looked at each person. "As most of you know, Morgan has expressed a desire to go back to Camp Willowmoss." All eyes shifted to me, and my heart began to pound. I had zero desire to go back to Camp Willowmoss. I had only suggested it because I wanted to help my sister. If it wasn't for her being there, nothing could get me to go back. I met the stares of the others, but Billy wasn't looking at me. Instead, he stared at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. His lack of support hit me again, and I questioned my decision. But when I thought of Amy being forced to participate in the Saturday challenge that very day, I really didn't have a choice. I had to go. I had to help her. I had to get her out of there. "Why do you want to do that?" Bryn asked, obviously not up to date on all that had happened since she'd left the night before. A look of confusion swept over her, and she turned to Billy. "I thought she didn't like it there?" Billy rolled his eyes, which made me smile. "Sorry, Bryn," Jack said. "I guess you didn't hear about Morgan's sister being taken in her place." "What?" she asked, her eyes snapping to me. Jack quickly filled her in. "That's awful, Morgan," Bryn said, a stricken look on her face. Appreciating her sincerity, I nodded, then said, which is why I've decided to go back and help her get out. Jack and I have been discussing how to make that happen, Danny said. Chapter 18. Though that didn't surprise me, it still bothered me that they were discussing my fate without me. After all, I would be the one taking all the risks. Shouldn't I be involved in that discussion? I forced down my annoyance and focused on what was important. Did you come up with any ideas on how to make it work? I don't want to go in as myself, obviously, but how can we make them believe I'm someone else? Your disguise is pretty good, Danny said, and we can add some glasses to help hide your eyes. But there is the issue of the retinal scan when you do your weigh-ins. She paused. They do use a retinal scan, don't they? I pictured this scale in the corner of the communal bathroom. The scale I had forgotten to use, which had led to a punishment of wearing a note card around my neck with my weight written in bold numbers. My roommate, Alex, had gotten the same punishment, and she had been furious. Not so much because of everyone knowing her weight, but rather because of the deduction in points that had accompanied the discipline. I'd fixed that, which led to its own complications, but at least it had gotten me back in her good graces. Yes, I said, the scale has a retinal scan, which was a big concern. Danny sighed. That could be challenging. Yeah, Bryn said. How can you trick that? It will know right away that you're Morgan, won't it? A small smile crept over Danny's mouth. Not necessarily. What do you mean? Billy asked. His interest, though minimal, made me happy. At least he was listening to the conversation. Well, Danny began, I happen to know a group of researchers who have been working on a type of contact lens that can have a person's retinal information hard-coded into it. Really? I asked, a feeling of hopefulness growing inside me. Danny looked at me. It's only been tested in the lab, but the results are very good. How good? Billy asked. I lifted my eyes to him and saw that he was listening intently. 80% of the time, the retinal scan reads the identity the way we've hard-coded it. So, 2 times out of 10 it's wrong, Billy said, obviously making a statement, and it knows the true identity of the person wearing the lens. Evidently not used to being questioned so forcefully, Danny hesitated. Yes. Billy looked at me. That's not acceptable. But 8 out of 10 times it works, I pointed out. Billy sighed and shook his head, then looked away. I ignored his negativity, though I was glad he was looking out for me. I directed my next question to Danny. What about getting out? Once you've secured your sister, she said, and gotten several power bars, we'll get you out. But how? I wasn't willing to settle for vague promises. This was my life, after all. We're still working out the details, she said. Billy got up and left the room. Everyone watched him leave, and I fervently wanted to get up and follow him, but I couldn't. Not with Amy trapped in Camp Willowmoss for months, maybe longer. How could I live with myself if I just left her there, especially since she was there because of me? We're not ready to let you go there just yet anyway, Jack said. My attention shifted away from the hallway where Billy had gone and back to Jack. What do you mean? I have to get Amy out right away. The longer I wait, the worse it will be for her. Jack held up his hands in a gesture of calm. I know, but to make this work, we have to do some preparation first. Like what? You'll need to put on some weight, Danny said. What? Bryn asked. My thoughts echoed her question. We can't just drop you off without a reason, she said. Are you saying I'm too thin? The idea was absurd. Days ago, I was still overweight. No, she said, but you need to be heavier for us to justify dropping you off. Dropping me off? Yes, of course, Danny said. We'll give you an identity, and we'll drop you off because we're concerned parents, and we want you to get the treatment you need. She paused. How else can we guarantee you'll be in Camp Willowmoss? She had a point, and it would certainly be more pleasant to be dropped off voluntarily instead of being tasered and dragged away by force. Also, Danny said, there's your arm. I glanced at the bandage on my right arm. It needs to finish healing before we take you back. Otherwise it will be very suspicious. I hadn't thought of any of those things. What else hadn't I thought of? Yeah, I said, I guess that's true. But how long will all this take? You should be ready to go in 3 to 4 weeks, Jack said with a smile. 3 to 4 weeks? I'd only been in Camp Willowmoss for 9 days, and that had been pure torture. How would Amy survive for 3 to 4 weeks?
The only other option, Jack said, is for you to turn yourself in as Morgan Campbell. Are you willing to do that?
I answered without hesitation, no, of course not. Going with a false identity was risky enough. If I admitted who I was, they would make sure I was in there so long that I would never get back to the tunnel in time. Assuming I survived Hansen and his undisguised desire to kill me.
Then you'll have to follow our plan. Jack looked at me with sternness. Agreed?
Not having any other ideas, I nodded. He slapped his palms against his legs and stood.
Good. Danny will design a meal schedule for you that should add the weight, and she'll keep a close eye on that wound. It won't do to have a scar right where they put the chip.
How much weight do I need to gain? I'd like you to put on about 15 pounds, Danny said. This was not good. Any progress I'd made by all those workouts in Camp Willowmoss would be lost. And not only would I have to start over once I was in there, but it would be even harder because I would be heavier than I'd been the first time around. Not only that, if I didn't get inside for another 4 weeks, I would only have 2 weeks to get Amy and get back out before the window of time to get in the tunnel would be closed. But what choice did I have? I could leave Amy in there and feel gut-wrenching guilt for the rest of my life, or I could do something to help her. When it came down to it, there really was no choice. Chapter 19. After Jack left, everyone wandered out of the room. Everyone but Danny and me. Let me see how your arm is healing. She motioned for me to sit by her. I did as she asked, and she unwrapped the bandage. It's healing well, but we need to do as much as we can to diminish the scar. She smiled at me. Like Jack said, it would be pretty suspicious if you have a scar right on the spot where they'll put the chip. The idea of being chipped again scared me. How would the rescue work? Would it work? There were so many unknowns. I have some cream that will help with the scar, she said. I'll bring it tomorrow. I nodded, a strong sensation of anxiety washing over me as I imagined entering Camp Willowmoss. For the rest of the day, I tried to think of things other than my future and just enjoy the company of everyone in the house. We watched movies and played games. It sucked that I couldn't go outside, but I didn't want to risk anyone recognizing me. I still had weeks before I'd be ready to face the world. That trip to the shopping center now seemed silly compared with the important work I had ahead of me, although it was helpful to know that my disguise had worked, at least among the 4 people who had seen me. Billy avoided me, which bothered me greatly. I'd hoped he would try to forget the future too and just be my friend, but instead he seemed to be paying a lot of attention to Bryn, which also bothered me greatly. I tried to ignore them, but Bryn was enjoying being around Billy so much that it was hard not to notice. Finally, I gave up and got a book from the meeting room, went into the room I shared with Kelly, and shut the door. I hardly digested the words I read. My mind focused on my plight, and I allowed self-pity to wash over me. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling until someone called me to come help with dinner. At dinner, Billy sat by Bryn and ignored me, so I ignored him and pretended his actions didn't hurt. I even flirted with Mitch, but he didn't seem to notice, which made me feel like an idiot. Danny made me eat 2 servings of dinner. I wasn't even that hungry, but I ate it anyway, hopeful that the sooner I was physically ready to go to Camp Willowmoss, the sooner I could get this whole thing over with. That night, after Danny, Bryn, and Tracy had left, and the rest of us were watching TV, except Jack, who'd gone into his office, I sat next to Billy. "Can I talk to you?" I whispered.
"What about?" he asked in his normal voice.
I frowned. "Please?"
"Fine."
He stood, and we walked into the empty meeting room. "How long are you going to be like this?" I asked.
"Like what?"
I sighed. "Refusing to talk to me."
He laughed. "I'm talking to you right now."
I folded my arms across my chest. "That's only because I practically dragged you in here." He folded his arms too.
"Look, Morgan, I've told you how stupid I think it is for you to go back to Camp Willowmoss, but you're doing it anyway. Why should I waste my breath talking to someone who won't listen?"
"So," I said, "because I won't do what you want, now you won't be my friend?" Hot tears filled my eyes at the thought. I tried to hide them, but Billy noticed. His voice softened. "I'm still your friend, okay?
I'm just worried about what will happen to you once you get in there."
Grateful that he was starting to be the Billy I'd been counting on, I smiled.
"When are you going anyway?"
I smirked. "If you'd stayed in the room, you'd already know."
"Well, I didn't, so I don't."
I laughed. "It'll be a few weeks." His eyebrows shot up.
"Really? I thought it would be right away."
"They want me to gain weight, and they want my arm to heal."
"Oh, that makes sense."
"I'm worried, though, about Amy."
"She's young. They'll probably go easy on her."
I fervently hoped he was right. Chapter 20. 5 days later, Jack gathered us in the meeting room. It was late afternoon, so everyone was there, even Bryn, who'd been coming over every day after school. This was the first time our group had met since my decision had been announced, and we were all eager to hear what Jack had to say. He reached into a small bag and pulled out a rectangular case.
"Morgan will wear these when she goes to the F.A.T Center."
He opened the case and lifted out a pair of eyeglasses, then handed them to me. I put them on, but my vision didn't change. The lenses were just clear glass. "What do you think?" I asked the assembled group. "Does it make me look less like myself?" "Yeah," Kelly said, "it does make a difference." "Don't forget," Danny said, "you're going to be wearing the contacts for the retinal scanner. They'll change your eye color too." "Oh, that's good." The more ways they could change my appearance, the better as far as I was concerned.
"Do those glasses feel comfortable, or do we need to adjust them?" Jack asked.
I moved them around against my ears. "They feel good."
"Those are very special glasses."
He smiled like he had a great secret.
"They have a hidden camera."
Everyone exclaimed their surprise. I took the glasses off and examined them more closely. I couldn't see a camera anywhere. Jack held out his hand, and I gave him the glasses.
"Let me show you how they work."
He motioned for me to sit next to him, which I did.
"To activate the camera, you squeeze here."
He pointed to the area just above the lens.
"You press the right side to start and the left side to stop. You can act like you're adjusting the frames and turn on the camera."
He handed them back to me.
"You try it."
I pressed where he'd said and felt slight movement, like a button being pressed, but it was only noticeable because I was expecting it. Then I put the glasses on and tried it. "How do you get the video?"
"2 ways," he said. "First, we can download directly from the glasses, but they're also programmed to search for an open Wi-Fi network once a day. If they find one, they'll upload the video to a place we've programmed."
"Doesn't that use a lot of battery power?" Nathan asked.
"Not as much as you might think," Jack said. "The battery will last for 10 hours before it needs to be recharged, which we think will be enough to get the information we need."
Jack looked at me.
"I'd like you to wear those around here and practice turning the camera on and off. To make sure you're doing it when you mean to, I'd like you to do it at certain times of the day while looking at a clock. That way I can tell if you've turned it on and off correctly."
"What am I supposed to record at Camp Willowmoss?" Jack glanced at Danny, who said, "We definitely need the power bars, but we also want video evidence that you're being forced to eat them, and of course anything else you think would be helpful for us to see." I could think of several things people who'd never stepped foot inside a F.A.T center would be shocked to see, starting with the Saturday challenge. I told them about what I'd experienced, and they had been disturbed by the details, but I knew it would be even more powerful if they saw it for themselves. Suddenly it seemed I had a greater purpose for going back to Camp Willowmoss. My primary mission was still to get my sister out, but if I could do something to help change things in this world, to really make a difference, that would be really cool. Over the next week, I got really good at turning the camera on and off, so good that I was able to do it without thinking much about it. Jack was quite pleased with my ability, which made me happy. Billy, on the other hand, was less than thrilled about the whole endeavor and continued to try to talk me out of it.
"Morgan, what do you think will happen if Hanson recognizes you?"
We sat in the family room watching TV. Bryn sat nearby, her gaze on Billy as he spoke.
"Do you think he's going to just forget what happened?"
At his words, a sharp pain flared in my chest. I was terrified of Hanson, or anyone else for that matter, finding out my true identity. "I know," I muttered, not wanting to admit that sometimes I felt my resolve slipping, especially when Billy brought up Hanson. That particular enforcer wanted to kill me, of that I was sure. And though my arm was healing well, and the cream Danny had given me really did help the wound fade, The scar to my spirit was still fresh and raw. "She's helping the cause, Billy," Danny said as she came into the room. "Sometimes it's about the greater good." A warning bell rang in my mind as the words of the pledge came to me unbidden. I pledge to always follow the rules and to take care of my body. I will strive to put the good of all above the desires of one. A healthy me is a healthy world. Was Danny advocating putting the good of all above my own desires? Of course she was. I'd known that from the moment they'd encouraged me to go in and help my sister. But that hadn't deterred me then, and I couldn't let it stop me now. I had to put aside my fears and focus on what was important to me, getting my sister out. I was only helping Danny and Jack because they promised they would get me out once I'd gotten the information they wanted. I had to believe that they could get me out in time. Billy glared at Danny, then stood and left the room. I watched him go as sadness washed over me. I was losing my one true friend. Of all the people in this world, he was the only one who was trying to keep me out of Camp Willowmoss. A few days later, after Danny had announced I'd gained 6 pounds, meaning I was that much closer to going back to Camp Willowmoss, Billy pulled me aside, practically dragging me into the empty meeting room. "Have they told you how they plan to get you out?" he asked, his eyes tight with worry. That had been worrying me, too. Sometimes I hated how he voiced my exact fears, making them all too real. "Not yet." He sighed and looked away. When he looked at me again, his eyes flashed with anger. "And you believe that they actually care enough to get you out?" "Of course." Actually, I had no idea, but what else was I supposed to say? "They'll need the glasses back," I said, "plus the power bars I can get." He shook his head. "Weren't you listening when they told you that the data from the glasses can be uploaded automatically?" "Yes." His logic upset me, mostly because it was right on. "But we don't know if there's an open Wi-Fi network at Camp Willowmoss." "Of course there is." "But it's probably secure, so the glasses won't be able to access it." "Unless they program to break into it." Trying to come up with a good response, I chewed on my lip. "What about the power bars? They need some so they can analyze them and verify the drugs." He looked at me like I was an idiot. "I'm sure they can get their hands on the power bars in some other way." "Oh, really? Like how?" "They can take them from a delivery truck or something." He grabbed my shoulders. "Morgan, don't you see? They're using you. As soon as they get the video they want, they'll leave you hanging." I stared at him, my eyes locked on his. Was he right? Would they do that to me? Then I thought about the betrayal he'd experienced from his own parents. Of course he wouldn't trust anyone. I wouldn't either if I'd been through what he had. But this was different. We were working together, as a team. They wouldn't do that to me. And then there was my sister. I had to get her out of there. I shoved his hands away. "I'm not doing it for them, Billy. I'm doing it for Amy." His jaw clenched. "Fine. Don't expect me to wait around and watch you destroy your own future." A wave of panic rushed over me. "What do you mean? Are you leaving?" He just shook his head and walked away, leaving me all alone. I almost ran after him to beg him to stay. I didn't know what I would do without him there. It was true that lately all we'd been doing was arguing over my decision, but I felt a bond with him. We'd been through the most terrifying days of my life together. What would I do if I couldn't talk to him? Chapter 21. The next morning, when I came into the kitchen for breakfast and saw Billy sitting at the table, relief swept over me. I'd half expected him to be gone. Mitch and Nathan were making breakfast. "Hi," I said, as I slid into the seat next to Billy, determined to act like everything was fine. "Hey." He didn't seem very enthusiastic, but I didn't let that stop me. "What do you want to do today?" I smiled brightly, hoping to cheer him up. He smirked. "We can watch TV. It's not like we ever do that." "No thanks." That was one activity I was sick of. He leaned toward me and spoke in a soft voice so Mitch and Nathan wouldn't hear. "Let's get out of here for a while." My eyes widened. "Outside? Like, in public?" He tilted his head to one side. "Don't you think it would be a good idea to see if your new look is still working? You know, since soon you'll be going right back into the lion's den?" "Yeah, I guess so." "Okay then, let's do it." "You mean everyone, right?"
No, I mean you and me.
But what about before, when that boy recognized you?
I'm willing to chance it if you are.
Was he testing me to see if I really had the nerve to go out in public? For some reason, it was important to me to prove to him that I could do it. Maybe if he saw I could get away with being in public unrecognized, he would finally support my plans to go back to Camp Willowmoss. All right. My voice didn't express as much confidence as I'd meant it to, so I nodded vigorously for good measure. He smiled, but he didn't seem happy.
Great, right after breakfast.
We both seemed to eat slower than normal. I don't think either one of us was eager to do this, but neither of us wanted to admit it. Finally, we couldn't put it off any longer.
Ready? He asked.
Ready for what? Nathan asked as he ate his breakfast.
Morgan and I have something we need to do.
Billy didn't show a hint of worry.
Oh.
Nathan seemed disappointed to not know what was going on. Billy raised his eyebrows at me, so I pushed my chair back and stood. Okay. I tried to sound confident. I followed him out of the kitchen and toward the front door. He opened the door and held it for me, and I stepped outside for the first time in 2 weeks. Jack's house had been an oasis, and I'd felt completely safe there. Now, even though we were just standing on the front porch, I felt exposed. Billy closed the front door and stepped off the porch. When I didn't follow, he turned toward me.
Really, Morgan? You're willing to go back to Camp Willowmoss, but you won't even step off Jack's porch?
Wanting to prove that I could do it, I gathered my courage and walked toward him into the sunlight. The bright light hurt my eyes. I'd been inside so much lately, I'd almost forgotten how good the sun could feel on a mid-October morning. I put my hand up to block the bright rays. Then I strode past him. Let's go already, Billy. He laughed as he followed me down the driveway into the sidewalk. We walked side by side, and my confidence grew with each step. It was easy to feel safe since there were no cars around. Then a car appeared at the end of the street, heading right toward us. As it approached, my heart crashed against my ribs, and when it pulled up next to us, I nearly screamed. The passenger side of the car was closest to us, so I couldn't see who was inside. "Who is that?" I frantically whispered.
"Calm down," Billy muttered. "Dang."
I glared at him, hating him at that moment because nothing seemed to ruffle him, and I wished I could be like that. The passenger window glided down, and a female voice yelled, "What do you think you're doing?" Billy squatted and looked inside. I stayed behind him, ready to bolt.
"Oh, hey, Danny,"
Billy said. Then he turned to me.
"Look, Morgan, it's Danny."
A wave of relief washed over me, and I bent over and looked into the open window. "Hi!" "Why are you outside walking around?" Her nostrils flared as she flung her hands outward. "Does Jack know about this?"
"I wasn't aware we needed his permission," Billy said.
Danny looked back and forth between us. "Get in."
"No, I don't think so."
Billy began to stand. Not sure what to do, I stayed where I was. Did I want to anger these people or keep them on my side? Without their assistance, I didn't have a good way to help my sister. But Billy had a point too. Why did we need their permission to go on a walk? Were we prisoners? "Morgan?" Danny asked. We wanted to make sure our new looks were still working." Danny's eyebrows drew together. "Why now?" Billy leaned toward the window.
"You all seem so eager to have Morgan go back to Camp Willowmoss when she's a wanted criminal. I just thought before she was exposed to people who hate her, we should see if random strangers would recognize her."
He paused.
"You do want to make sure the enforcers don't recognize her, don't you, Danny?"
Danny made a scoffing sound. "Of course I do."
"So we're all in agreement," he said with a smile.
Danny stared at him for a moment. "What did you have in mind?" Billy glanced at me, one side of his mouth tugging upward.
"We want to go to the plaza and walk around."
For a second, I didn't know what he was talking about. Then I remembered that in this world, the plaza was their version of a mall, the only difference being that there was no food court. "It's probably not even open yet," Danny said. "Plus, all the kids your age will be at school, so you'd really stand out. I don't think that's such a good idea." Billy seemed to consider this.
"Fair enough, but this afternoon there will be plenty of kids our age there. We want to go then."
I stared at him, wondering why he thought he could speak for me. The more I thought about going to the mall, the plaza, the less I wanted to go. Not only would kids our age be there, but plenty of enforcers would be there too. "Look," Danny said, "I think we all need to discuss this and plan it out." Billy shook his head with vehemence. "No, you people haven't even come up with a plan on how to get Morgan out of Camp Willowmoss when she's in. I'm tired of waiting for you to plan. No, we go this afternoon, or Morgan and I are gone." My eyes rounded. What was he trying to prove? I opened my mouth to protest, but he put his hand on my back, and I stayed silent. Danny shifted her attention to me, I guess to see if I agreed with Billy. A sudden sense of loyalty toward the boy who had done so much to help me, and truth be told, was still looking out for me, came over me, and I nodded my agreement. "Yes," I said, "we need to test my new look some more. I need to feel confident that it's going to work." Danny sighed and looked out her window, then back at us. "Okay, fine, we'll do it your way. But for now, please come back to the house. This afternoon I'll drive you to the plaza myself, I promise." She pulled away and drove to the house, and we turned around and walked back. Chapter 22. The rest of the day, it was hard to focus on the different activities we engaged in. Watching TV, playing games, cleaning up, working on our studies. I kept visualizing how the afternoon would go. Billy and I would be walking down the middle of the plaza, maybe stopping to window shop every so often, when out of nowhere a dozen enforcers would surround us and take us into custody. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Danny came into the family room and announced it was time to go. I'd been halfway hoping, okay, maybe more than halfway, that she would break her promise and we would stay here, but Billy seemed eager to go. He jumped up, then turned to me with a smile and pulled me to my feet. After a brief discussion, Danny decided no one else would come along. It would just be Billy and me. A short time later, we pulled up to the plaza. "I'll wait here," Danny said, "but if something happens and you're recognized and arrested, don't contact Jack or me. We can't take a chance on having our group discovered." A chill shot up my spine. If anyone recognized us and turned us in, we would be on our own. That thought terrified me. I turned to Billy to see if he changed his mind, but he didn't seem deterred by her warning. "Okay," he said. Then he opened the door and got out. Reluctantly, I got out too. Even though I was scared, if there was to be any chance of succeeding in going back to Camp Willowmoss, I would have to conquer my fear. This was just a bunch of stores. If I couldn't manage to go in there and survive, there was no hope of me going into Camp Willowmoss. Billy and I walked side by side toward the entrance. I think he sensed my trepidation because he took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I appreciated his presence. There was no way I could do this on my own. No way. Which made me worry even more about going into Camp Willowmoss by myself. We walked through the doors and headed toward the long walkway that stretched to the department store at the other end of the plaza. Dozens of teenagers wandered the plaza, which helped me feel less conspicuous. We stopped at a cell phone kiosk, and I looked at the latest phones. Billy let go of my hand, which I immediately missed as my security blanket, and began looking at the different models. After a few minutes, I poked him in the arm. "Let's go." We turned away from the kiosk and took a few steps toward another store when I saw a pair of enforcers walking in our direction. My stomach clenched, and I feared I might vomit right there on the plaza floor. That would surely get the enforcers' attention, so I swallowed convulsively to get my gut under control. Billy took my hand again. "You belong here, Morgan," he whispered. "We're just two kids hanging out at the plaza after school." Unable to speak as abject terror gripped me, I nodded. Billy tugged me forward, and I forced my feet to move. I was wearing the camera glasses, and no makeup, since I wouldn't be wearing it in Camp Willowmoss. I hoped that having the glasses on, plus my new funky hairstyle, would be enough to keep the enforcers from connecting me to the wanted girl. As they got closer, my heart pounded so hard I was certain they must see the rhythm under my shirt. They spoke to each other, not a care in the world, and glanced at the people in the area. I tried not to look at them, but couldn't seem to stop myself, and the eyes of one of them brushed over me. He wrinkled his nose and shook his head like he thought I was disgusting, but then his focus slid off of me and onto someone else. After a moment, they'd passed us. I thought I would faint with relief. The only thing keeping me upright and mobile was Billy's hand in mine. "See?" he said softly. "All they saw was a fat girl. They didn't see you at all." I wasn't sure if I should feel insulted or comforted, but decided on the latter because I knew that's how Billy meant it. "Thanks." We walked around a while longer, then went back to Danny's car, sliding into the back seat. "It went okay?" she asked. "Yep," Billy said. Even when the enforcers stared at me, I added, giddy that I'd passed this trial. "Enforcers?" She turned in her seat to gape at us. "Yeah," Billy said. "It was no big deal. They just walked past us." Danny spun back around, her gaze shooting in all directions. "They didn't follow us," Billy said. She turned to Billy, her lips compressed. "You have no idea how hard we've worked to keep our identity concealed." Billy didn't say anything, just stared back. Danny started the car, and we drove back to Jack's house. When we arrived, everyone, including Jack, wanted to hear how it had gone. Now that it was over, I was more than happy to tell them every detail. "Sounds like your disguise is working pretty well," Jack said. "That's good to hear." That night, I slept soundly, my confidence in my disguise growing. The next morning at breakfast, I was surprised when Billy wasn't already at the table. And when breakfast was over and he hadn't shown up, I became alarmed. "Where's Billy?" I asked Nathan and Mitch, since they shared a room with him. They looked at each other. "I don't know," Mitch said. "He wasn't in bed when I got up. I assumed he'd gone somewhere." He hadn't mentioned anything to me about going anywhere. I pushed back from the table and ran to his room. His bed was unmade, and there was no sign of him. I heard the front door close, and I sprinted toward it, my heart racing in relief that he was back. But it wasn't him. It was Danny. "Good morning, Morgan." She had a bright smile on her face. "Do you know where Billy went?" She looked confused. "Went? What do you mean? Isn't he here?" Fresh panic pounded through me. "No, he's not." "Maybe he wanted to test his disguise a little more," she said. As I digested this idea, I bit my lip. Would he do something like that without telling me? He must know how worried I would be. "Maybe," I said slowly. "Tell you what," she said. "Let's give him some time to come back, and then we can start looking for him, okay?" I didn't know what else I could do. "Okay." An hour later, he still wasn't back. Chapter 23. "We need to go look for him," I said to Danny and Jack, who were talking in low tones in the family room. "Please." Danny turned toward me. "Morgan, be honest with me. Has Billy ever said anything to you about leaving?" I vividly recalled his comment 2 days before when he'd stated he didn't want to stay around and see me ruin my life. I'd believed him then, but after the day before, when I'd felt so much closer to him, I thought he'd changed his mind. I thought he would stick around and support me. "Sort of." "What did he say?" Jack asked. "He kind of implied he didn't want to be here when I went back to Camp Willowmoss." Danny glanced at Jack, then smiled at me. "There you go, then. He must have been upset and left." I didn't like it. Of course not. Why would I? My one true friend had abandoned me. My shoulders slumped, and I sank onto the couch. "It will be okay," Danny said, coming over to sit next to me. "We're still here." She gestured to the room where Jack, Nathan, Mitch, and Kelly were assembled. "We're here to make sure this mission is successful." She smiled at me again. "It's important to all of us that this goes right." I worked hard to push aside my devastation and recalled Billy's concern that Jack and Danny hadn't come up with a plan to get me out of Camp Willowmoss. "Speaking of the mission," I said, wishing intently that Billy was by my side to back me up, "what ideas have you come up with to get me out of Camp Willowmoss once I get my sister and the information you want?" "We were just discussing that," Jack said from his easy chair, "and we've come up with some really great ideas." "Like what?" He laughed. "We'll break it all down for you once we have a solid plan, but don't worry, Morgan. We're going to get you out of there." That was easy for him to say. He wasn't the one going into the lion's den, as Billy had called it. "How long do you think I'll have to be in there?" "Just a week or 2, Danny said. I did a quick calculation. If I was to get to the tunnel on time, and if I spent up to 2 weeks in Camp Willowmoss, I would need to get inside within the next 2 weeks. When do you think I'll be ready to be dropped off at Camp Willowmoss?" As I said the words, my heart stuttered. The reality was getting ever closer. Danny's eyebrows went up. "I didn't realize you were so eager to go." "It's not that," I said without thinking. "Then what is it?" I couldn't exactly tell them I only had until November 10th to get back to a tunnel that would take me to another universe, but I did have another good reason. "I just want to get my sister out. The longer she's in there, the more traumatized she's going to be." Danny nodded. "Yes, I can see how that would be a worry for you." Her calm attitude irritated me for some reason. Maybe it was because I knew she really had no idea what went on inside the F.A.T center I'd been in. Or maybe it was because she would be safely outside while I would be risking everything for their cause. Did she truly appreciate what I was going to do? Sudden anger toward them bubbled up inside me. Because of them, I'd been forced into a position that had led to Billy leaving me. I stood. "I need to be alone for a while," I said. I went into the room where I'd been staying and closed the door. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, picturing Billy sneaking out early this morning. Why couldn't he even come say goodbye? Was he afraid I would try to talk him out of leaving? I rolled over and faced the wall as tears filled my eyes and dripped down my face. All along, I'd known how much I cared about him and how much I'd relied upon him, but it wasn't until that moment that I truly understood how alone I felt without him. He was the only person who knew my secret, and yet he'd stayed by my side. When we'd left Fox Run after my failed attempt to get back home, he'd promised me that he would make sure I got back to the tunnel in time. Now that was all in question. I was completely on my own. Could I even get there without his help? I would have to. I had no other choice. But what about this crazy mission to Camp Willowmoss? Should I even do it? Should I risk it? Before, in the back of my mind, I'd believed Billy would make it all work out for me, somehow. But now he was gone, and it was all on me. Did I really have it in me? Then I pictured Amy, who at that very moment was probably hunched over a toilet, scrubbing away someone else's excrement, an enforcer hovering over her, taunting her as she worked in a drug-induced stupor. Could I condemn her to 6 months of that, and probably longer once they added on the time to punish me for stabbing Hanson and escaping? She was only 13, and she had done nothing wrong. Gut-wrenching guilt over what I'd caused battled with crushing terror over what my future held. I curled into a ball, wishing with every fiber of my being that this was all just a nightmare, and that if I could just wake up, it would all magically go away. I squeezed my eyes closed and pinched my arm over and over, but nothing changed. I was still in this world. Amy was still in the F.A.T center in my place. Billy had still left me on my own, and it was still up to me to make everything right. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling for another minute, then pushed myself off of the bed. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, clearing away the evidence of my tears, then went back into the family room, resolved to get this done and over. "Morgan," Danny said. She looked pleased that I had come back on my own. Gathering my courage, I said, "Let's make this happen." Danny's smile grew. "Wonderful." I didn't know that I would call it that, but I was committed to this crazy mission, 100%, and now I wanted to get it over with. Chapter 24. The next 12 days flew by as the clock ticked ever onward toward the day I would be going back to Camp Willowmoss. I'd gained 14 pounds since arriving at Jack's house. That would be more than enough to qualify me for a stay at the F.A.T center. The wound on my arm had healed nicely, and the cream Danny had provided had made the spot where Billy had cut out the chip virtually invisible. Unless Dr. Bradley, assuming she would be the one to insert the chip again, was looking for something out of the ordinary, she would never notice the faint mark. Jack and Danny had also worked with me on a backstory in case any of the kids I met wanted to get to know me. For the last week, I'd been wearing my new contact lenses, the ones that were supposed to trick the retinal scanner into believing I was someone else and hide my true identity, the ones that worked 80% of the time in the lab. I fervently hoped they would work in real life. It was exactly 2 weeks until I had to go into the tunnel and attempt to get back home. The next day, someone was going to drop me off at Camp Willowmoss, and I was terrified. When I'd made the commitment to go back, I had felt good about it. But now that the time was imminent, all the fear I'd held down was insistently pushing its way fully into my consciousness. There was no hiding from it now. Bryn did a fresh dye job and trim on my hair. Then, after dinner, it really felt like a last meal, Danny asked everyone to gather in the meeting room. When we got there, a woman I'd never seen before sat on the couch. She looked like she was in her 40s. Her makeup was expertly applied, and her hair was swept into a chic knot at the back of her head. The only people who seemed to know her were Jack and Danny. "Morgan," Jack said, "I'd like you to meet Susanna." He gestured toward the woman who smiled at me. "She'll be posing as your mother, and she'll be dropping you off at Camp Willowmoss tomorrow." "Hi, Morgan," she said, then glanced at Jack. "Or should I say Hannah?" "Who's Hannah?" I asked. "That's the name encoded into your contacts for the retinal scan." "Oh." I felt like an idiot for not catching on. "Okay." I turned the name over in my mind, getting used to the feel of it. "What's my last name?" "Jacobs." "Hannah Jacobs," I murmured. "Keep in mind," Jack said, "Hannah Jacobs is a real person." "What?" This information was unexpected. Then again, they told me they wouldn't give me the name until the last minute. Now I understood why. "We had to use a real person," Danny said. "A person who's been weighing herself regularly. We can't very well drop you off and give them a name that's not in their database." "So this Hannah I'm impersonating, where is she right now?" "She's in a safe place." I didn't understand. "So if she weighs the same as me, why didn't they come pick her up and bring her to the F.A.T Center?" "She was using her annual waiver," Danny said, "so they don't know about her weight gain yet." "Annual waiver? What's that?" I asked without thinking. Danny looked confused. "You don't know what an annual waiver is?" My face flushed, and I scrambled to give a reasonable explanation as to why I didn't know something that any rational person in this world would obviously know. "This whole thing is just stressing me out." "Everyone gets a few weeks a year where they don't have to weigh themselves," Nathan said. "You know, like if you go on vacation and a scale isn't available or something. But you're not supposed to use it more than like 3 times a year." I smiled at him gratefully, then shook my head like, "Duh, I knew that." "Oh yeah, of course." "Anyway," Danny said, "when Hannah last weighed herself, she was close to her weight limit, but not quite there. Then she supposedly went on vacation, and now you'll be dropped off as her, and they'll help you get back on track." I nodded. "So it was weight gained on vacation?" "Exactly," Danny said. I thought about the all-inclusive cruise ship vacation a girl at school, in my other world obviously, had told me about. She'd said it was like a food party, people eating constantly. I wondered if those vacations existed here. I doubted it. "Hannah's information is encoded into your contact lenses," Jack said. I wondered what this Hannah Jacobs thought about me using her identity. Had she gone along with it willingly? "Early tomorrow morning," Danny said, "Susanna will pick you up. The 2 of you will drive to Camp Willowmoss and she'll check you in. They won't be expecting you, but they have procedures in place for drop-offs." I'll bet, I thought, wondering how the experience would be different from the first time I'd been processed. "You haven't told me the plan for getting me out." "Yes," Jack said, "we know." He glanced at Danny. "Once you finish gathering the information we need, this is how it will go." He outlined a plan that involved a team breaking into Camp Willowmoss and bringing Amy and me out. The plan sounded pretty good, although after having gone through an escape once before, I knew things didn't always go the way they had been planned. "How will you know I've gotten all the information you need?" I asked. "And how will I know when you're coming?" "Good questions," Jack said. "Like we told you before, there's a program embedded in the chip in the glasses that will connect to the Wi-Fi at Camp Willowmoss. That's how we'll download the video you've recorded." He paused. "Unfortunately, we won't be able to warn you when we're coming, but believe me, when our team gets there, you'll know." Not feeling 100% confident, but trusting them nonetheless, I nodded. "You have a very busy day ahead of you tomorrow," Danny said. "I suggest you get a good night's sleep. Susanna will be here tomorrow morning at 5. I'd enjoyed sleeping in a bit while staying at Jack's, but that would become a thing of the past. I told everyone good night and got ready for bed. And so it begins, I thought. Chapter 25. Not surprisingly, I had a hard time sleeping. I tossed and turned all night, anxiety making a good night's sleep impossible. A mixture of excitement and dread about the next day's events washed over me. Excitement that the mission I'd been working toward was finally here, and I would finally be able to get it over with. But the dread was even stronger, as I had no idea how things would go. It ended up being easy to get up and be ready by the time Susanna got there, as I'd been awake and staring at the dark walls well before it was time to get up. At breakfast, I had no appetite. The knot in my stomach took up all the space. When Susanna arrived, everyone was there to tell me goodbye. Everyone but Bryn. She had to be at school. Soon enough, we were on our way. I stared out the window. I couldn't see much in the dark morning, and imagined everything going smoothly and perfectly. As the sun rose, and we got closer to Camp Willowmoss, my hopes rose too. There was no reason everything couldn't go exactly as planned, right? When I saw the exit sign for Camp Willowmoss, my stomach clenched, and I got a terrible pain in my gut. The blood drained from my face, and I thought I might pass out. "Are you okay, Hannah?" my fake mom asked. At first I was startled by her calling me that. I was nowhere near used to it. Then I looked at her. "Not really." "I'm sure everything will be just fine." How did she know that? Did she have a crystal ball in the back seat that she had failed to show me? "When I check you in," she said, "they'll just see a chubby girl who has come to get some help. Nothing more." I desperately hoped she was right. I nodded, but didn't feel any better. We exited the freeway, and after a few minutes, Camp Willowmoss came into view. I couldn't pull my gaze away from the building where I'd spent the worst 9 days of my life, and where my sister had spent much more time than that. Everything looked so different from before. Then again, the first time I'd arrived, I'd been immobile in the back seat of Hanson's car, and the second time I'd been outside of Camp Willowmoss, it had been the middle of the night, and I'd been busy running for my life with Billy, so of course it looked different. Susanna pulled into a parking place near the guard shack. As I stared through the car window at the fence next to the guard shack, I vividly recalled the night Billy and I had run through that opening with Hanson's threat to kill me fresh in my ears. Susanna opened my door, bringing me back to the present. "Ready, Hannah?" I had to admire her ability to stay in character, but I was having a hard time doing the same. I had to become Hannah Jacobs. If I didn't believe it, no one else would. "Yeah, Mom." I forced one foot to touch the asphalt of the parking lot. Obviously pleased with my answer, Susanna smiled. "Good. They'll get you the help you need here, sweetheart." Wow, she was really into this. Then I saw that an enforcer had walked up behind her and was listening to every word we said. I didn't want to look at him. What if he recognized me? But I had to know if it was Hanson. I wore my glasses and had my colored retinal scanner tricking contacts in, but I still had a hard time looking at the man in the uniform. If new kids who were dropped off at F.A.T centers were supposed to be scared, I would have no trouble playing that part. As I put both feet on the ground, I glanced at the enforcer behind my mom and felt a rush of relief that it wasn't Hanson. Maybe he had been moved to another F.A.T center and I wouldn't see him at all. That thought gave me confidence, and I looked at Susanna. "I know, Mom. It will be for the best." Then I got out of the car, and she shut the door behind me, giving me nowhere to hide. "Let me get your things," she said. Then she walked to the trunk and popped it open. As I'd gained weight, Danny had bought me a few things to wear, and now those items were packed in a bag that Susanna lifted from the trunk. "Here you go, honey." She wheeled the bag over to me, and I took the handle. "Thanks." "Can I help you?" the enforcer said. "Yes, you can," Susanna said. "I'm here to drop off my daughter for a little stay to help her lose a few pounds." I looked at the enforcer to see what his reaction would be, and it was just as I'd expected, though that didn't remove the sting. He sneered at me as he looked me up and down, never looking at my face. "Yes," he said, "she needs our help." Anger that all he saw was an overweight girl swept over me. How would his expression change if he knew it was the infamous Morgan Campbell standing in front of him? I pictured his eyes widening in shock. Then I relaxed a bit. Of course it was a good thing all he saw was my body and not who I really was.
"Follow me."
He turned toward the guard shack and walked through the opening in the fence. We followed him up the concrete path toward the main doors. We entered a foyer that had a reception area with a pair of couches, side tables with magazines, and a long counter where a woman sat behind a computer monitor. Several beautiful green plants were placed around the room, making the space appealing. It reminded me of an upscale doctor's office, all warm and inviting. I'd never been in this room before. Obviously, this area was reserved for the families, so that when they dropped off their loved ones, they would believe that they were taking them to a wonderful place that was just there to help. Only one door led out of this room, and I knew what was on the other side. I'd been there before, and it was not warm and inviting. It was cold and frightening.
"Louise will help you," the enforcer said,
motioning to the woman at the counter. Then he went back outside to make sure no one entered or left without his knowledge, leaving Susanna and me alone. "How may I help you?" Louise asked. "I'm here to drop off my daughter," Susanna said with perfect calm. I, on the other hand, was anything but calm. My heart thrashed inside my chest, and I had a hard time looking away from the door I would soon be entering, the door to the lion's den, as Billy had called it. Oh, how I wish Billy was with me now. I needed him, desperately. How could he have left me on my own? Yes, I knew it was my choice to come back, a choice I was now seriously doubting. But he must have known I would need him more than ever right now. Even if he wouldn't be standing next to me, just knowing he supported me would have made a tremendous difference. "What is your daughter's name?" Louise asked, her hands poised over her keyboard. "Hannah Jacobs," Susanna said. I was glad she'd answered, because I had lost my ability to speak. The desert had nothing on my dry mouth and throat. Louise asked Susanna a series of other questions and had her sign a small stack of papers. All the while I stood frozen beside her, my thoughts flying in a million directions at once. "You're doing the right thing," Louise assured my mother. "Your daughter will get the help she needs here." Then she smiled at me. "A healthy you is a healthy world." A shiver of dread raced up my spine and blasted into my skull, and I knew I had made a colossal mistake. This has been Dare to Defy Part 2, Parallel World, Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2013 by Christine Kersey. Morgan's story continues in Dare to Defy Part 3.